Hi again, my name is Ajiri Uzere, and like was already said, I am a Fulbright research scholar conducting research in Nigeria. I am also Nigerian American, so this Fulbright and also this topic specifically is very exciting and extremely personal to me. So I'm really excited to be talking about this today. I'll be talking about what I believe could be the next era of African development, focusing on the connection and potential power when it comes to connecting youth on the continent with the youth in the diaspora. So that's my presentation today. So, according to the United Nations, about by 2030, Africa will be home to the largest youth population. And specifically talking about Nigeria, the youth make up over 70%. And I kind of want to contextualize this number just a little bit because Nigeria is the sixth most populous country in the entire world with a population of about 230 million people. This means that within Nigeria alone, there are about 161 million people under the age of 30, making its population larger than the countries Russia, Egypt, and Mexico, which is insane. And in addition to the large youth population on the continent, there's also a very large African diaspora, which is estimated to be around 200 million people, according to the World Economic Forum. And around 60% of that is characterized as youth. So we clearly know that Africa is young. The diaspora is large, it's well resourced, and globally connected. However, these two realities are rarely leveraged to be talked together in the context of African development. And so I want to talk about the possibilities that exist when they are. So, the current problem and historical state of African development is that it's often been externally defined. It's been one that's very transactional and also one that is often void of real life input. We can take a look at a very notable example being the play pump that was developed in 1989 and implemented at scale in the mid 2000s. It's an example of this. So, sure you all know what it is, but the play pump was a merry-go-round style water pump designed to pump groundwater into elevated storage tanks that children play on. So, children play, water is pumped, and then it is accessed via tanks. And this project was extremely popular in southern and eastern Africa, including in Malawi, Mozambique, and South Africa, which makes sense because the idea seems very genius. However, it failed for so many reasons that were social, structural, and technical by nature. So it turns out that the play pump needed to be pumped for several hours a day, sometimes even up to 24 hours a day, and kids simply could not play enough naturally to meet the demand. And it inadvertently relied very heavily on child labor. And when children weren't willingly and unwillingly playing, women were forced to then step in the gap. On a more technical level, the play pump was complex in its parts, meaning that it malfunctioned, and when it did malfunction, the locals weren't able to fix it, and parts weren't being produced locally. They weren't taught how to maintain these play pumps, leaving these users very reliant on outside forces, which is the exact opposite of what we want to see from development projects. And worst of all, what did work in those areas, being those hand pumps, were replaced by these play pumps, leaving these communities worse off than they were before. So these metrics of success were ones that were only appealing to those who implemented in the question of how many pumps did we implement rather than those who were using the pumps. So was the solution actually successful? And the solution didn't consider those local contexts that it was being implemented into. And it clearly prioritized this external definition of what success looked like rather than true positive transformation. And this is a very clear example of how local voices matter very little in the design, implementation, and maintenance of a development project. But the play pump isn't the only one, and there are so many more examples of modern day failed development interventions. And one that I wanted to talk about is the Lake Turkana fishing processing plants in northern Kenya. This was funded by the Norwegian government. It costs about $22 million to implement, and The project was designed to create jobs, turning the Turkana people into commercial fishers and fish processors for export. And on paper, this seemed like a very strong initiative, similar to the play pump, in that it promoted employment, infrastructure, and integrated people into global markets. But this project collapsed literally almost immediately because the Turkana people were semi-nomadic, they're pastoralists, and in their social and cultural context, fishing was not only undesirable, but it was also stigmatized. So it's like asking a community to adopt fishing as their primary occupation. And this wasn't just like some sort of economic shift, but it was literally a cultural contradiction to what was happening on the ground at the time. And beyond the fact that it was culturally insensitive, it was also very impractical. So this required a energy intensive freezers and a large amount of clean water in one of the most arid and remote parts of Kenya. So the operation costs were unsustainable to say the least, and the facility shut down in just a couple of days. And today, this remains a fully built, highly visible, and completely unused development project. And in both these examples, the voices of youth on the continent and within the diaspora were completely left out. There were technical and social conversations that could have been had that would have shaped the design and implementation, but those didn't happen. So the question is, how do we leverage the people whose skills and who are skilled, who are invested and available to reshape how development projects are constructed? And how do we transform the youth from being beneficiaries of faulty initiatives to being decision makers of successful ones? So, to talk about the African youth and the opportunity that we have, African youth are cultural translators, right? They are very tech savvy, they're system thinkers, and although they are rooted locally, they have connections globally. They don't just understand the problems of Africa, they have lived through these global solutions. They are privy to the context in which things succeed, but they also know how things fail. And so that lived experience is incredibly invaluable for so many reasons, including these. I think that African youth really, like was said before, should not just be beneficiaries of these developments, but they should be critical drivers. They should be shaping development. This generation has grown up alongside rapid expansion of mobile phones, the internet, digital platforms, and we see time and time again that these tools are not just used to consume the internet, but they are, or consume information, but to create solutions. And across the continent, young Africans are building businesses, they're making movements and technologies that are responding to their local problems, whether that's in health, agriculture, education, climate, or finance. And a fun fact that I didn't know prior to my Fulbright was that the majority of African startups are actually led by people under the age of 35. And in just 1 year, the continent startup ecosystem raised about $2 billion. Dollars. And that growth wasn't just from coming from copying models and copying and pasting into Africa, but it came from adaptation that resulted from true understanding of the cultural context that they were living in. So for these young people who understand both formal and informal sectors, they know how to translate policy into practice and how to avoid theory from breaking down on in real experiences. And I think that's what makes this generation so powerful. They've seen what doesn't work and they've inherited the consequences of failed development projects, whether that's failed schools, unused infrastructure, or ideas that are very well funded but don't understand the cultural context. And instead of repeating those mistakes, these youths are building differently. They're prioritizing things that are flexible over things that are good for optics or scaling just for scaling's sake. They want outcomes and they want sustainable development. And I think that if we're seriously considering reimagining African development in this current age, which I think is very important to have that conversation, there needs to be a serious conversation about trusting the youth to lead development. Because we've seen that development designed without those in mind struggle to actually work in the context, but development that is designed by those who live those realities, that navigate those systems, and then remain invested in the outcomes are the ones that are actually inclusive, transformative, and ultimately sustainable, which is exactly what we want. But the reality is that African youths can't do it alone. They need long-term partners, and I think that's where the diaspora comes in. The diaspora, which I'm a part of, is often seen as just being deep pockets for people to tap into. However, I think that the most powerful diaspora contribution is not just capital alone, it is strong and sustained commitment to African development. And I think that we're seeing a big shift in diaspora engagement with this current generation of youth. Socially, it feels like there appears to be a trend in reduced remittances or the action of just sending money back to the continent. But according to the World Bank, there is actually a tangible dip of about 0.3% in 2023. But having said that, diaspora engagement is trending towards more intentional and more long term, where empirical evidence is kind of limited in the area because of the recency. There's a lot of anecdotal claims that there's an increased trend in Africans moving back to the continent after having lived abroad or schooled abroad. And there is an increased economic opportunity for these Africans coming back to the continent. And so a question that I've been wrestling with is how diasporans seek to engage on the continent. Like, what are they actually looking to do? And that's something that I've been looking through during my Fulbright. And one thing that I keep hearing when I ask these questions is that there's just so much opportunity for growth. There's opportunity on the continent. And so we need to work together to create an atmosphere on the continent that promotes the reframing of diaspora engagement from being deep pockets and transactional to one that's very intergenerational, not just for now, but for future to come. And one that is not just about giving back through charity, but one about building up the continent itself, and one that prioritizes collective responsibility in a way that advancing the country and the continent is something that diasporans are deeply invested in, but also one that deeply invests back into diasporans as well. And to do that, I think that we need to create safe spaces that are shared. That's one, shared spaces that is there to build stronger collective identity that binds Africans on the continent with those in the diaspora. And I don't think that there's any better place to start than with the powerhouse that is the youth population right now. And so I've been putting this theory into practice through my organization, Diplomat in Training. The lack of youth engagement in the decision-making process globally is exactly why I founded this organization. Diplomat in Training aims to bridge the gap between global diplomacy and youth leadership with a special focus on the African continent. And I define diplomacy as the art of addressing relevant global issues that are sometimes but not always charged in a manner that prioritizes cooperation. So, keyword cooperation. And I believe that diplomacy exists in every sector, in any sector, whether that be finance, arts, health, politics, development, whatever it may be. The goal of this organization is to contribute to an environment that is constantly evolving and becoming one that respects and also seeks out youth voices in decision-making processes. So, one thing that I realized through doing this on the continent is that there isn't just a need for information, which is good, panels, workshops, and webinars, but there's also a need for spaces where it is created through trust and honesty, and one that is created for shared responsibility. And so thus far, in on the continent, I have partnered with Lagos Food Bank to bolster youth economic prospects in Nigeria through career development workshops. But I've also created space for intentional and honest conversation, bringing together people on the continent and within the diaspora. And one of our signature series being, oops, one of our signature series is Beyond Borders, and this is an avenue in which we connect with the broader population seeking to engage with the global sector. And our next Beyond Borders conversation actually is happening tomorrow, and it's focused on strengthening that diaspora continent connection through small group dialogue centered around a couple distinct themes. And through our event, we are prompting both people on the continent and in the diaspora to confront that disconnect that appears to exist through a couple questions, including questions like, can long-term impact be built without permanent relocation? If so, what does that model look like? What structural, cultural, and institutional hurdles make it difficult for Africans to on the continent, build a continent as for and by them? And then also, do you feel that Africans have a shared collective identity that goes beyond surface level similarities? If so, what are they? And if not, why not? The goal is to prompt conversations with people in the diaspora and on the continent and to find common ground that leads to solutions. Another initiative by Diplomat in Training is working towards fostering stronger community through an initiative titled Beyond the Table. So, Beyond the Table is a curated dinner series bringing together globally minded leaders across industries, whether that be policy, business, culture, academia, tech, for intentional conversations about power, influence, and global change. And so, each dinner is centered around a different theme and reimagines what networking looks like to be more of a guided, more intimate environment that fosters deep relationships and cross cultural, cross industry insights, as well as long term collaboration. So, both these initiatives aim to utilize relationship building as a form of infrastructure needed to produce intentional development that is for both people on the diaspora in the diaspora and within the continent to feel responsible for the development and using conversations as a development tool to drive development forward and ensure that every type of person is included in that process. So, when we are thinking about refining development that is centered around youth engagement on the continent and in the diaspora, it's important to kind of redefine what we're looking at. So, development historically has looked like aid, but that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about collaboration. It's about whether resources, institutions, and decision-making structures are actually aligning with what's happening on the ground, what people are experiencing on the African continent right now. Are they culturally competent? Because we've seen what happens when things are very well funded but aren't culturally competent. They still struggle to succeed, right? It's not just about age-based leadership, who has been in the game longest, but also who's closest to the problems. The people who are often closest to the challenges are the ones that best understand how systems break down and where there is room for intervention. And it's also not just about the return of the diaspora. You don't have to relocate physically for your impact to be meaningful. It's about being relational, engagement showing up through sustained collaboration, through knowledge exchange, and through long term commitment, something that is not just, again, relocation or a one time investment. So, as I close up, I want to present some questions for reflection for you, being what kind of barriers you foresee relating to youth engagement within the global space, and how can we work to overcome that? What are you doing right now that can benefit from the youth voice? And how do you plan on going about seeking out those voices? And are there areas in your life that are passively or actively countering the development of collective African identity? And how can you address that? I really want, if you're listening, to realize that there's an opportunity for a true reimagining of African development. And it starts with youths both on the continent and within the diaspora gaining the autonomy and shaping their own futures. And like was said before, it's not a question of like, are youth capable? Like they're capable. It's about who's ready to buy in and support their efforts. And so I know for me, I am extremely committed to seeing that transformation, and I am open to collaborations, to conversing, and just reflecting on the subject matter. And so, if you want to collaborate, if you want to converse, if you want to reflect, I am all ears. I'm open to listening, and feel free to reach out, and I am more than happy to connect. So, thank you so much for listening.